Bi'ur Mishnah Yud, the explanation for Mishnah Yud. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Shlosha midot bebikurim. There are 3 levels to Bikurim. There are 3, we think Bikurim, bringing of the first fruit, is 1 level. No, there are actually 3 levels to them. We only talked about 1. Actually, we talked about 2. We actually talked about all 3, but we just mentioned them. So what are the Shlosha midot? Shlosha dvarim klulim bebikurim. There are 3 things, 3 levels that are included in Bikurim. Shedinehem chalukim. And the laws for them are going to be different. The laws for one level is going to be different than the laws for another level. So let's see what are the laws. Ha-Bikurim, first of all, it's the easy one. This is the Bikurim. This is the fruit that you put a reed around on the tree in your field, and now you're taking it to Yerushalayim. This is the main fruit. Ha-Bikurim, Hainu Ikar Bikurim. This is the main point of the Bikurim. Kmo sheshaninu be'atchalat pirkenu, like we mentioned in the beginning of our chapter. Which one? Yored Adam letoch sadeu. This is the one where it says a man goes into his field. Vero'e te'ena shebikra, eshkol shebiker, rimon shebiker, koshro begemi. He sees a fruit that sprouted out and he marks it. He puts a reed around it. Ve'omer harei elu bikurim. And he says, behold, this is bikurim. So this has certain laws which are going to be different. This is the main thing. So we're going to be more strict in it. But then there's a secondary Bikurim. What are those? It's called Tosefet Bikurim. We discussed it yesterday a little bit. This is the Tosefet Bikurim. The rabbi says you cannot just bring 1 fruit. You have to bring a percentage. I think the percentage was from the rabbis 1/60th, if I'm not mistaken. But I'll have to look it up again. He might mention it here. ותוספת ביקורים, בשעת לקיטת הביקורים, at the time that you are going to gather the first fruits, נוהגים להוסיף פירות על אלו שהפרשו. The custom is to add more fruits on these ones that we already took out. שכן שנינו לעיל בית ד', because we already mentioned above in Mishnah Bet, in chapter Bet, Mishnah ד', שהביקורים אין להם שיעור. It says from the Torah it's enough to bring 1 fruit out of your whole field, out of your whole orchard. והרוצה לעשות כל שדהו ביקורים עושה. But the one who wants to make his entire field bikurim, he's allowed to do the entire field. So in other words, people brought more than just the first fruit. So that's Tosefet bikurim. Now, so already we see there's a difference. What's the difference? Bikurim is a mitzvah from the Torah. The Tosefet Bikurim is a mitzvah from the rabbis. So there's going to be cases where you are going to be strict if it's the fruit of the Bikurim, and the same case you're going to be lenient because it's only the fruit of the rabbis. Because if it's only
it's not obligated from the Torah.
It's not obligated from the Torah. So in those cases you might be able to go lenient. So when it comes to prohibitions from the Torah, which is the main fruit, you will have to be stringent. But when it comes to the Tosefet, to the addition Bikurim, the one you take extra from the rabbis, those you can be lenient in some circumstances. And then there's a third level that we discussed yesterday also. What's the third level? Ve'itura Bikurim. And we said yesterday that you're allowed to decorate the basket with other Bikurim. You're allowed to take anavim and add them to the anavim.
This is not the only, the toes that you put on?
Besides the toes, you can also do it with fruits. As they said, if you remember, around the figs, they used to put grapes around the basket. Ve'itura Bikurim. This is called the ornamentation of the Bikurim. Haperot hanaim hamishubachim. This is the nice fruit. Shenotnim al gabei saler Bikurim, that you put on top of the basket of Bikurim, lenoi velehidur, for beautifying purposes. In other words, this one have got nothing to do with Bikurim. And it's important to know which one is which. כמו ששנינו במשנה הקודמת, like we mentioned in the previous Mishnah. So, let's look at some of the rules. So, let's say you have a pomegranate tree. and you want to add more pomegranates or more fruits. So you're only allowed to add as tosefet pomegranates. You cannot add grapes, you cannot add figs as tosefet, as an addition. It has to be the same kind that you ate. Tosefet Bikkurim, when it comes to the addition of the Bikkurim, it has to be min bemino. It has to be the same kind. אין מוסיפים על הביקורים אלא מאותו המין. If you want to add the תוספת ביקורים, you have to add that same specific species. You cannot add the 7 species. You cannot get one species on another species.
That would consider a bikurim.
תוספת ביקורים. תוספת ביקורים. תוספת ביקורים.
Not bikurim.
Not ביקורים.
Okay.
כגון ענבים על ענבים. For example, this is grapes, you put on grapes, or תאנים על תאנים, or figs on figs. But when it comes to itur habikurim, when it comes to make it beautifying the basket that you're going to bring, you're allowed to give min b'she'eino mino. You're allowed to give pomegranates and grapes. Because this is just for what? Just for beautification. It has nothing to do with bikurim. כגון סל של ביקורי ענבים, for example, if you have a basket of grapes, מעטרים בתאנים, you're allowed to put ornaments, figs, ושל ביקורי תאנים מעטרים בענבים. And if it's of figs, you're allowed to put ornament it with grapes. וכיוצא בזה, and similar to that. ולדעת רבי שמעון בן ננס, שהוא המשנה הקודמת, and we said, according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas, you can even ornament it with apples. You remember, he said you don't even have to have fruits of the 7 species. As ornament, again, as what? As ornaments.
Yeah, just to beautify.
To beautify you, Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas said you can use any fruit. מעטרים אפילו מפירות שאינם משבעת המינים. He says you can even use oranges, apples, whatever beautiful fruits you can find. יש גורסים גם במשנה הקודמת, there are those who learn also in the previous Mishnah, רבי שמעון סתם כמו במשנתנו. So it says, if you notice Mishnah Tet, you don't have it, Mishnah Tet started with Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas.
Yeah.
And our Mishnah starts with Rabbi Shimon Omer. The question that everybody is asking is it the same Rabbi Shimon? So there are some say it's the same Rabbi Shimon who says the previous Mishnah says our Mishnah, and some says no, it's a different Rabbi Shimon.
Rabbi Shimon Stam.
Yeah,
Now I understand what is Stam.
That's a Rabbi Shimon, different Rabbi Shimon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now what's so important to know which level it is? So it has practical implication. It has practical application. Now Bikkurim, let's talk practically. What happens with the Bikkurim? The Israel gives it to the Kohen, the first fruit, and the Kohen looks at Bikkurim as cash. It's a charity for him. What does he mean? He goes and sells it. Now, there's a problem though if he goes and sells it. It needs to be eaten by a Kohen while pure. The purity of it has to last. So what do you mean he goes? So he says, okay, so he goes and sells, he can go and sell it in the Kohen market. There was such a thing as considered to be a Kohen market. Only Kohanim bought it because people knew that these fruits have to be pure. And then what does he do with the money? He can do whatever he wants. He can buy donkeys, he can buy dogs, he can buy whatever he wants. He can do with it whatever he wants. Now, this is a little bit strange because we learned before on Ma'aser Sheni, or second tithing, that when you exchange fruit, you're only allowed to exchange it for other fruits. You're not allowed to exchange it for money, or you're allowed to exchange it to money but back to fruits. In other words, you cannot leave it as a donkey.
To eat it.
Yeah, you have to eat it. You have to be consumed. Bikkurim doesn't have to be consumed by the Kohen. He can do with it, it's his property, he can do with it whatever he wants. The question is, what about the Tosefet Bikkurim? And what about the Itur Bikkurim that he gets? What is he allowed to do with them? So that's what we're going to discuss now. So let's continue. Tosefet Bikkurim nechelet betahara. The addition of the addition part, the one from the rabbis, that the rabbis instituted, don't just bring one pomegranate, bring a little bit more. For example, one of 6 years, like we said. It has to be eaten in purity. In other words, they tell the Kohen, you're right, it's your property, but it's holy. It has a holy idea behind it. It is holy. So therefore, when you eat it, you have to be pure. שאינה מותרת באכילה אלא לכהן טהור. So it says to the Kohen, you can sell it to whoever you want, as long as he's a Kohen, and as long as that Kohen is pure, he's allowed to eat it. Otherwise, you are disgracing the Bikkurim, you are disgracing the mitzvah. ואם נטמעה, and if it happened that this fruit became impure, אסורה באכילה כדין הביקורים. Then it is prohibited in eating, just like the regular Bikkurim. So in other words, we're going to treat the Tosefet Bikkurim just like Bikkurim.
Like the animals or anything else?
No, Bikkurim means first fruits.
Or the fruits.
The first fruits.
Yeah. So what would make it become impure?
Anybody who's impure who touches it. As long as some liquid touched the fruit beforehand. If no liquid ever touched the fruit, then it doesn't become impure. But if a liquid touched the fruit, and then an impure person touched the fruit, doesn't have to be wet. After the liquid touched it, the impurity transfers, his impurity transfers into the fruit. We're usually talking about we're going to get to the laws of purity and impurity much later on in the Mishnah. Okay? Uptura min admai. And this is an interesting. The Demai is a concept that we didn't accept, the Kohanim didn't accept food from Jews who were not so-called learned, because the unlearned Jews did not know the rules so well. So they accepted food only from learned Jews. It's called chaverim, because members. If the person was not a member, he wasn't accepted. We didn't accept his produce. And we will consider his produce Demai. Demai means, what is it? Like, we don't know if the guy gave the taxes correctly, he gave Truma, he gave his food to the Kohen, we don't know if he gave this food to the Levi, so therefore we are worried about this produce. So over here, the Tosefet Kohanim, the question is, he's going to explain. Uptura min admai. It is not obligated in the Demai. What does it mean? Kohen shekibel bikurim me'am haaretz. A Kohen that received the first fruit from Am haaretz, from a farmer, not a learned guy. Hachashud shelo yefrish ma'asrot. That usually these guys, we are, a lot of them, because they were not learned, did not give the tithing correctly. אינו חייב להפריש מעשרות מתוספת הביקורים. So we can tell him, oh, you got the bikurim from an Am haaretz, from a regular farmer. So therefore, usually what will happen, the person who buys the produce, he will have to give from the produce he bought a little bit to the Kohen, a little bit to the Levi, because he doesn't trust that that guy, the farmer, did it. He says, over here you don't need to, because the guy, the farmer is allowed to give his entire field bikurim. So therefore, it doesn't belong to the Kohen, and it doesn't belong to Levi. And another thing, he can give the Kohen to him. He's the Kohen.
What do you mean?
He's a Kohen, right? So instead of giving it to another Kohen, he can keep it in his pocket. Because he's the Kohen himself. That's another reason. Okay? Mishum Demai. Beram, הביקורים עצמם פטורים אפילו ממעשר ודאי. The bikurim themselves are not obligated, even if for sure it needs to be a meiser. כמו תרומה שפטורה ממeiser. It's just like truma that is not obligated in meiser. Let's discuss this a bit. It's exactly like in America. You don't have to pay taxes on charity.
Right.
So because it is charity, that's right, there's no tax on it. So because it's already taxed as a Demai, as a Bikurim, I'm not going to tax it again as Truma. You don't put a tax on top of a tax. Although in America, I think in some places they do. But the concept is that you're not supposed to put a tax upon tax. והיינו, שאם קיבל הכהן ביקורים שאינם מאוסרים, which means that if the Kohen received bikurim, that the guy tells him, You should know. I didn't give the coin anything. The farmer tells the coin in the temple, I was supposed to give Meiser, I was supposed to give 2% to the Kohen. I didn't. This is all Bikurim. I didn't give yet. So you should give. Dina ki Bikurim sheptura afilu b'maser v'dai. Even if you know for sure he doesn't need to give a tax on it, because Bikurim itself is a tax. Velo nakta Mishnah Demai. So why did the Mishnah tell us specifically Demai? It says don't learn that it's only Demai. It's any tax. It just gave an example. Ela mishum itura Bikurim shebesefer. Over here it mentions Demai because in our case there's going to be a case with Demai, so it already mentioned Demai. Okay. And the last one. So we have Bikurim and Tosefet Bikurim are very similar. Except the Itur Bikurim is going to be very different. Why? Because the Itur Bikurim is a present. You give it to the Kohen as a present. Oh, you're giving it to me now as a present, so I have to be careful in all those things that I'm worried. So the tax. You gave it as a present. So I'm worried about all the things that Ama'aretz, that a simple person who is not learned, didn't do with it. In other words, I'm going to be worried about all the things in the Itur Bikurim.
This is like considered as regular fruits.
That's right. It's just like you bought it in the market.
Yeah, if you give somebody a
very good. It's just like you bought it in the market. That's why we need to know the different levels over here. Ve'itur Bikurim chayav betmai. Now, the ornaments, those is not part of the mitzvah at all. This is a present, and therefore it is obligated in the laws of Demai. Kohen shekibel bikurim me'am haaretz, a Kohen that received bikurim from a simple person, chayav la'aser misafek al haperot shel itur bikurim midin Demai. He needs to give tithing. I think the funny part is he gives tithing to himself. He's a Kohen.
Well, he gives to Levi, no?
Oh, so he doesn't need he's not worried about the Levi from Demai, because the only reason we're worried about the Levi Demai of the 10% that the Levi is supposed to give to the Kohen. He says, I have it anyway. He says, I have it anyway. Yeah. So I don't think we're worried about it over here, the Levi at all. We're only concerned about the Kohen because he says, I got it. What do I care? The Levi didn't get it. That's the guy's problem, not my problem. חייב לעשר מספק על הפירות של מדין דמי. כל שכן שחייב במעשר ודאי. And of course, if he knows that the guy didn't give מעשר, then of course he has to give. Beram, but now comes the question. It says that when you eat a mitzvah, for example, when you eat the Bikkurim, and the Bikkurim was a mitzvah, it was a mitzvah from the Torah, you have to eat it while you're pure. You have to keep your purity when you eat it, because Bikurim is a mitzvah. It's one of the commandments. But when you just eat regular stuff, regular fruit, you don't have to keep yourself pure for that. You can be in a status of impurity and eat regular fruit as a Kohen. You're allowed to.
Only Kohen.
Anybody can eat regular fruit instead of impurity.
So the Bikurim is not, you don't have to be pure?
The Tosefet, it says you do have to be pure.
You do have to be
But the ornamental Bikurim, it is not part of the mitzvah. It is just as a beautifying agent.
Right.
For that, you don't have to be pure. Beram, im mutar lo le'echol betumah. But we're talking about the Itur Bikurim.
Yeah.
So Itur Bikurim, they have a question now. What about, of course, the Bikurim, the Tosefet Bikurim needs to be pure while eating it because it's a mitzvah. The question is, when he eats the Itur Bikurim, can he eat it while not impure? Because it was a present. So let's say, אם מותר לאכלו בתומה, if he's allowed to eat the Itur Bikurim while he's impure, לא ברור ממשנתנו, we're not quite sure from this Mishnah. ויש מוכיחים מדברי הרמב"ם, there are those who prove from the words of the Rambam, שאף איתור הביקורים אינו נאכל אלא בטהרה. That the Rambam, it looks like if it comes together with the Bikurim, you have to treat it just like it is Bikurim, even though we all know it has nothing to do with the mitzvah, it's a present. כתוספת הביקורים וכביקורים. So the Rambam says it is, the Kohen is obligated to eat even the ornamental Bikurim just like Bikurim itself. But there's no proof from our Mishnah. Where does the Rambam learn it? We're not sure. Finished Mishnah Yud.
If you go logically to Sefer Bikkurim, sometimes you don't know for sure what it is. Where is the Tosefet? No. So maybe that's why you have to do everything in Torah.
Very good question. Very good question. But I'll tell you why we're mentioning it now. Now you understand the logic. It's a very good question. So in places, there are many places where you won't be able, the coin will not be able to know if it is itur or not itur. But in some cases, it's easy to know. For example, we said that Rabbi Eliezer, that's what we said in the beginning of the Mishnah, that you're allowed to beautify it with a different species.
Right.
So if it's
apples there,
not just there. If it, for example, you brought figs, the guy he puts as an itur, he puts grapes. So then you know that all the grapes. That's why he mentioned it in those Mishnahs to tell you that there are going to be some cases where you know for sure which one is the itur. You're right. In some cases you don't, but in those cases that you know for sure, maybe you should treat it as Bikkurim. Or you don't have to treat it as Bikkurim. So the Rambam says, even though you know for sure, and even though everything, you still have to treat it as Bikkurim and eat it while purity.